Hey, so I just sort of wanted to do a short one here. I think briefly I mentioned about like a game sort of having influence on me, and I wanted to really talk about the games that had influences on me. Whenever I think about that, I always sort of think about what the first sort of games I was playing were, and I really do think that the first few games you play, like when you're growing up, that sort of like calcifies this idea of like what a video game is. And I think what's sort of important about me is like the first two video games I played, they started out as like demos that I got from like a video game magazine or something, and I got those, and I got really into them, and I ended up buying them with my own money. So in some ways, demos do work, I guess, if you're like 12 or something and you have more time than money. Um, what those games were is they were Tachyon the Fringe, which is a game I think that was uh, Nova Logic or like Logitech or like some partnership between those two or something like making the game. I know that the company used to do a lot of like flight sims, but like Tachyon the Fringe was sort of a space sort of version of that, and it had had Bruce Campbell doing the voice, which I mean he did a wonderful job, and let's just say like that kind of made that game a lot better than it should have been, or than really it needed to be, I should say. But the other game that I played was Mech Warrior 4. And Mech Warrior 4, for anyone who's like, or the Mech Warrior series, for anyone who's like unsure, um, it's basically a game where you pilot a giant robot, and there's a bunch of different giant robots, and there's a bunch of different like weapons you can put on the giant robot. And so you're kind of always working to slow it out, but it's also sort of in like the simulation genre. Like you have like a button to like turn on the mech and a button to like you know do some kind of fancy controls with locking your torso twist and like all sorts of weird stuff. And different parts of your mech can get blown off. It's all good stuff. So but so what that means is that like the first like few games that I really played, they were definitely very simulation heavy, and it was actually really interesting to me because like both of them had like major choice points in them. So like as you would play that game, like Tachyon the Fringe, you have to make a very clear choice in really like the first like quarter of the game. I'd say you have to make like this choice point where you have to be like, oh, I'm gonna side with this faction or this other faction. And then in Mech Warrior, you don't have as many of those points, but you do have a lot of like moments where like because you chose this mission or because you chose this thing, you got either like a new pilot, like or wingman sort of pilot person to help you out, lance mate is I think what they call them, or you could have a like new missions could open up, and of course MechWarrior 4 plays much more into this like there's like this pseudo medieval theme to it. Think of it as like kind of like a Dune-ish sort of feeling where like you have like noble houses and stuff, and everyone's trying to backstab each other, kind of like Games of Thrones in space with giant robots, which is when you say it out loud, it sounds amazing, and it is. Like the main point I was getting at is that like the games I played, they all had stories, and you made choices through them. They affected the plot. Like being a kid and having played like really two games kind of like obsessively into completion, like that was just like what I thought video games were. Like I didn't have this other concept that like games could be in a way like linear or like they could only be played out one way. But as I got older, I played more games. And like I remember playing like Half-Life 2 when that came out. Um, and I remember like sort of really enjoying that and like really kind of being surprised and interested in like the physics system of it and being like, oh, like here's this game that like I kind of knew what like a shooter was. I had not like really seen it be like, oh, like you actually have to like really think and sort of like have this like puzzly understanding of the world in a sense. But it was also very different too. Like it didn't have like any real choice points. You don't decide anything in Half-Life 2. You just play the game. You kind of get through it or you don't. Um, and so I remember I played that for a fair bit. Orange Box came out, played that a ton, probably too much. Well, either too much or not enough. I can't decide. Um, But it wasn't until like the next game that like oh yeah, I should mention this because like I think I mentioned like Fallout 3 and like New Vegas being an influence. And like at the time I was aware of like RPGs. I'd also played Neverwinter Nights around the same time. So I was kind of like aware of like there's like these different kinds of games and um sort of the way those all sort of played out to me was like I think in my head like I kind of had this idea like I really wanted to see like a combination of like the things I really liked, which were like these first person shooters and like RPGs. And then I saw like Fallout 3 come out. And I'm like, oh, this should be the game that I really like. And in some ways, I really did like it. I think I ended up liking, like most people, New Vegas more. But there was just sort of this whole element of like, okay, we're like combining aspects together. And I know people talk a lot about like the RPG elements being added to like everything. But really those are like levels, and those are like levels and classes and skills and stuff like that. I didn't necessarily think of those as like necessarily the most RPG of RPG elements. In some ways also it was like the ability to talk to people and the ability to do that sort of thing was kind of what I liked, and the ability of like the sort of like the promise that those games made, where like you could specialize in different things and still have a way to sort of complete the game. That to me was like a very very interesting, very kind of powerful thing. And then because you could essentially play that game multiple times. So it was in a sense it was like the in the earlier games like those big choice points. It was essentially like that, but you make it at the beginning and you don't really know how it's going to play out. But like there's a silent promise that the game says to you. It's like yeah, it'll work no matter how you do this, or hopefully it'll work no matter how you do this. Um, and so this wasn't until and I actually looked it up like when I had bought this game on Steam to make sure I got this timeline right. Um, this would have been after high school. I think this was probably when I was going to. I think this is either before I was going to community college or when I was like going to community college. And just to like sort of lay this out, like after high school, I really did not know what I wanted to do, and like everyone had applied to colleges, but I was just sitting there and I was like, I do not know what I want to do, and I think that like going to college right now would kind of be a mistake. So I didn't immediately apply to college. But my parents were like, you can't just sit on your ass. You gotta like do something. So, um, my parents they're good like that. They won't let me be too lazy. And so they were like, okay, like if you don't want to go to like a college with like a full 4 year degree, UW, whatever, you gotta either get a job or go to community college or do something. Um, so I went to community college and there was a video game design degree there, and I sort of enrolled in that just to like see like is this something I really want to do with my life, and I really loved it, and that's kind of what led me to transferring out to another college to like finish that degree. So this is like my mindset is like I don't really know if video games are cool or not, or if like this is a life a life goal to me or not, what I should do. It was in this time that I played Deus Ex for the first time, which sounds kind of funny, but this is like almost you know 8, 9, 10, maybe 10 years after release or so. So like I'm kind of late to the party. But that was like the first time I really played a game, and I was like, oh wait a minute, like this is kind of doing everything that I like. This is doing all the bits that I think are like games should be doing. You get to make choices. As I've read more about immersive sims, they don't really like to use the term puzzle, but like there were moments that like felt like puzzles where you could just be clever and like interact with the systems and do things. It was really a very like transformative experience to sort of think about. It's like, oh wait a minute, like this is kind of the way like games can be. So that was sort of probably like the biggest real like motivator to me. Is like, oh, this is sort of like probably one of my like biggest influences. And I guess I should probably also talk about so there's a game by Blendo Games called 30 Flights of Lovin', and that was like it was like a first person game, and it's like 5 minutes long. Yeah, 5 minutes, right? And it's a very unique style of game where it's like instead of like a first person shooter where like you're going through and all the levels are like continuous, or like you like there's moments where you're like going through and you're like kind of like jumping between scenes, in sort of this sort of storytelling, sort of almost like, I don't want to say cinematic, because cinematic has a very different meaning, but a very like movie-ish sort of quality to it, where you're making cuts and things like that. And I think that was important to me because it also kind of saw helped me see this other side of like games as like sort of the this is when like the Indian side of things was becoming really big, and you could start to kind of like understand like, oh, like the preconceived notions of what a video game has to be, like that it doesn't have to be there. You can change things up a little bit. And like to like a further point, there's a guy, Robert Yang, or Radiator Yang, what is kind of what he posts under, and he used to do this. He'd do these streams or these videos called Level with Me, where he would like go through like the level design of generally like first person projects. It was always really interesting to see his take, because he had a kind of a more like academic tone to some things, but he also was like very much in, like sort of like a Gonzo level designer sort of commentary sort of stuff. Because he had like built smaller levels, he still does, great little things like that. And so he could though like kind of break down some more of the indie sort of titles, and it really kind of opened me up to this sort of idea that like the way AAA is making games, and like this idea of like trying to be very like photorealistic and naturalistic, and like the way like trying to represent things in the world the way they are, like you don't have to do that. Like you can have style outside of that, and there is style outside of that. Those are a lot of kind of weird sort of influences. Because on one hand, I've been talking about how I was sort of grew up. Some of my first games were like simulations, and then sort of how like there's this sort of like RPG element to like this very like it's just like RPG sort of immersive sim sort of style. So it starts to come in, and then you start to see like this artistic side of like, oh, you can also just have very abstract games. So I think sort of like all of those things together kind of come to me as like when I'm thinking about making a game or stuff like that. Sometimes when I'm thinking about how do I solve a problem, I don't necessarily go to like the simulation side of things, although I can. I will go towards, sometimes I'll just be like, well, if I don't want players to go in a particular place, I just won't. If it's essentially if you have a white room and like a button on the table, nobody's gonna like get lost, right? They're gonna go to the button because that's all there is. Unless you're someone like me and you're like, oh, I should just like explore everything. Um, which is honestly also just my quality assurance instincts coming through. But I guess I just sort of wanted to sort of bring that in. I sort of like those are the games that sort of influenced me the most. Although I do want to give sort of an honorable mention is that like the first video game that I actually remember playing wasn't any of those. It was actually Myst, which I think my dad had like purchased for like this old like Gateway 2000 computer in like the 90s. And like I was like, I don't know, like 7 or something. Like 7-year-olds, you can't play Myst, but you can still click around, you can still figure some stuff out. And I think my brother like he figured out a few things, and like every once in a while I'll sort of like think about it, or you play a little bit or something like that. And I remember like I got it in VR, and I was kind of sort of surprised at how much I remembered, but it was a very eerie experience, because it was almost like I was like remembering like a dream that I had, because it always has kind of a fantastical sort of feeling to it. But since remembered how to do some of the puzzles, like I could kind of figure out how things worked, or kind of figure out what I was supposed to do. But yeah, it was pretty wild. Not really an influence, but definitely like yeah, that definitely the first one I played. Um, I would say as far as things that weren't an influence, a lot of like early like Nintendo 64 games, console games, things like that. I didn't have a lot of those when I was growing up. 'Cause had to buy all my own games with my own money. Those tend to be a little bit more expensive, and they tend to be like a little bit like they had to be something special for me to buy, and I was always a little behind that curve. I still sort of am. I was kind of grew up as a PC guy and kind of stayed the same way. Um, but yeah, that's basically all my influences, clear video game influences that I have offhand. I'll probably get into some more stuff later on, but alright, so that's all I got about that. And yeah, I think I'll just call it now.